Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. Well, my time here in Sao Paulo is winding down. Only got a few days left. I'm actually feeling a little bit under the weather right now. Every time I come to visit Sao Paulo, during my stay when I was living here, I don't know. It just seemed that, I got sicker quicker or faster or more easy living in Sao Paulo than I ever did when I lived in Michigan. My kids are coughing and sneezing. Everybody's got a sore throat, and it's just, man, I think it's time to go back to the US. Um, my daughter has asthma, and I noticed that when we moved back to they were born, my kids were born here in Sao Paulo. So obviously we're here, visiting friends and family. Uh, and she had asthma. But living in Michigan, she has done very well, has not had to use her pump really at all since we moved to Michigan. Um, this is the shortest time I've been able to stay in Brazil. I usually stay at least 3 to 4 weeks, and then of course I lived here for almost a decade. So I didn't, a whole lot of things I didn't get a chance to do because, you really this in a city as big as Sao Paulo and as many people as I know, it's just not enough time to to reconnect with all the people that you would really like to. But, I've been into the Brazil thing for 23 years. So, I'm gonna continue to come here for whatever the time that I can. I'm gonna try to get a couple of things done before I finish up here. But it's been an intriguing visit. I got a few other things I want to close out, but had to definitely check in because there's so many there's always so much to talk about. When the topic is racial issues in Brazil, and today is no different. Today's topic, I'm going to be talking about something that has been a constant over the years that I've blogged and done videos because you can't really get into race in Brazil without dealing with this topic. You know, you have reports. Well, people for a long time, Afro-Brazilian activists have declared Brazil as having the largest Black population outside the African continent. To be more specific, they'll say Brazil has the largest Black population outside of Nigeria, which is said to be the most populous country with the most Black people in the country, right? And when you look at reports online, you're going to get either one of two reports. You're going to get one report that says, oh, Black Brazilians make up about 110 million people in Brazil. Then you get other reports that'll say, well, no, the number is closer to 15 to 20 million. And I've always had to explain this discrepancy. The larger number, 115, 120 million, whatever, it includes the category known as pardo, meaning mixed or brown. And by itself, the Pardo category is actually the largest percentage of Brazilians in the country. I think Pardos represent something like 47% now. The preto category, which means people who specifically define themselves as Black, when I started studying Brazilian stuff back in 2000, the preto population was never more than 5 or 6, maybe 7%. But the thing is, over the years, that's been growing as the issue is that within that Pardo category, and a lot of people believe that Pardos are a completely separate category than just Black, while other people say all Pardos should be considered part of the Black population. And for many years, I also ran with that, saying that Pardos were just Black. But after living in Sao Paulo for a number of years and visiting several states in this country, I've had to come to my own conclusion that says, yes, there are Pardos who are Black, but all of them cannot be considered Black. There are so many types of racial mixtures here, and you meet so many people that you'll see and be like, well, how do I classify this person? Because they're mixed to the degree that you just cannot realistically put them in one classification. Now, when I say Black, I'm talking about people who you can see as visibly Black, whether they have light, dark skin, curly hair, or kinkier hair, or whatever. You can look at that person and for all intents and purposes say, I believe, well, I see this person as Black. And I've just honestly had to say that a lot of Pardos that I meet, I simply can't call them Black, right? I mean, if some of the people that I would see listed as Pardo, I'm like, if you're going to count them as Black, then that would mean almost everybody is black. So I had to specifically move away from all pardos are black myself over the years. And this is just, as a result of my own experiences visiting the country and living here. So with black identity politics having grown just really quickly over the last decade and a half, we're seeing a phenomenon now where more and more people are defining themselves as specifically black. Many of them are leaving from the white category, or they're leaving from the Pardo brown mixed category, and they're moving over to the black category, saying, I see myself as black. Now, a lot of those are actually legitimate people who have gone through a process of identity development. But then you have the frauds. They're even international media outlets have talked about this situation where politicians who have long defined themselves as white have suddenly started defining themselves as either pardo or preto, meaning brown or black. And that has to do with the funding that groups of politicians get classified according to their color. So if there's funding out there and there's funding that's increasing for non-white people, these white people will suddenly become black or brown just so they can get a piece of that, money to advertise themselves for, upcoming elections. It's kind of ridiculous. So this is like the third or fourth time since about 2011 that I've talked about the idea that people defining themselves as specifically black continues to grow in the country. So I want to take a look at this today because another report recently came out. Now, full disclosure, this article today, I always like to cite my sources. The article that I get from that I'm basing today's piece on is actually from Mundo Negro. It's one of the largest Afro-Brazilian media platforms in Brazil. And this particular article was written by the founder of the website. Her name is Silvia Nascimento. And today's article is called "Number of Brazilians Who Call Themselves Black Reaches a Record Number, but Majority Say They Are Brown." So this is to say the preto category continues to grow, specifically black, but the pardo category remains the largest category on the Brazilian census now. And this is really important because of the material that I'm going to be talking about over the coming week, because the discussion is really exploded, and there's a huge debate going on about this right now. So let's just get right into this. Number of Brazilians who call themselves black reaches a record number, but majority say they are brown. So what they're saying here is basically that even with the increase of people specifically defining themselves black in Brazil, there are still a lot of people who are defining themselves as pardo, even if other people might see them as black. Take this woman, for example, here. I don't know how she defines herself. This guy he would identify himself as black, I would assume. In Brazil, you can find people who look like him who'll still say that they're not black. So it still happens. But this woman, I see her as a light-skinned black woman. She could define herself as black, but I don't know that she does because I don't personally know her. So this is the issue at hand that we're talking about. So let's get into this piece today by Silvia Nascimento. More black and less white. This is the way Brazilians see themselves, according to figures revealed this Friday, the 16th, by the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, or the IBGE, obtained by the last census conducted by the National Household Sample Survey in 2022. The data come after 2 years in which it was not possible to carry out surveys because of the pandemic. The number of Brazilians who declare themselves preto, meaning black, has increased in Brazil in the last 10 years. If in 2012 they were 7.4% of the population, in 2022 they were 10.6% of those interviewed, being the racial group that grew the most. Never in the history of the country have so many people declared themselves preto or black. Now, again, this is not to say that Brazil hasn't had a large black population. It's just that because of the stigma associated with being black, many people who would be black or white, black to me or you, have defined themselves as brown over the years. And quite frankly, I've always said, well, to me, Brazil is clearly more than 10% black. But these are the people who have chosen to just mark the category preto instead of pardo. In my view, considering the conversations that are going on now, I've said this for a few years now that I've changed my whole position on this. To me, the time has come for Brazilians to drop I wouldn't say drop the Pardo category, but people who want to define themselves as black, the time has come for them to leave the Pardo category and move over to the black category. That's just the way that I see it. Because some of the controversy that's coming up is talking about a lot of white Brazilians, and I mean white, quote white, because a lot of white Brazilians would not be white in other countries, but defining themselves as white for most of their lives. Now they're moving over to the Pardo category also for various reasons. I'll talk about that in another video. So let's keep this moving. We explain and try to understand why this is such a confusing issue. I have a few pictures of just some Afro-Brazilians that some people would be familiar with. This is actress Adriana Lessa. She's, I wouldn't say a top actress, but she's always been like possibly top of the B list of actresses in Brazil. Been out, I don't know, a couple of decades maybe. Among those who declared themselves pardo, meaning mixed or brown, there was no significant variations. They were 45.3% in 2022 from 45.6% in 2012. This is the largest Brazilian racial group, which is also a big deal because like for the first decade that I was, checking out racial issues in Brazil, the top racial category was, white. It was somewhere between, I don't know, maybe 46 to 48% of Brazilians identified themselves as white. And I say white in quotes because many of those white Brazilians know that they have mixed ancestry. In the US, they probably would not be considered white, but in Brazil, they can call themselves white because you can have African or indigenous ancestry and still define yourself as white in Brazil, which is a little different from what happens in the United States. The white population, on the other hand, decreased from 46.3% in 2012. This group is now 42.8%. There has been a drop in the white population in all regions of Brazil, being most significant in the South, where it represented 78.8% of the population in 2012, down to 72.8% in 2022. Now, this is significant because in numerous videos, I've always said that the southern region of Brazil, which includes states like Paraná, Santa Catarina, and Rio Grande do Sul, this region has always been considered the European section of Brazil because about 80% of the population defined itself as white. But as you can see, this population or people who have defined themselves as white has dropped a whole 6 percentage points in the south of the country. One has to ask, why is that? Is this just more people taking on a racial consciousness, knowing that they're not exactly white? Or are these people who are adapting a black or brown identity because they don't want to be associated with some of the discussions on white supremacy that are going on in Brazil today and for a number of years? This is actor Babu Santana. A lot of people know him. Again, I wouldn't say he's a top list actress, but he's up there, known for a number of prominent roles. I remember him most for his role in the Tim Maia, popular Brazilian soul singer, the godfather of Brazilian soul music, Tim Maia. He played Tim Maia in a film. He also, became very popular for his appearance in one of the recent seasons of Big Brother Brazil. Now, indigenous people and quilombolas have a specific census. The data were also collected in 2023 and should be released soon. Indigenous people, obviously meaning the Native Americans or Native Brazilians of Brazil, and quilombolas are like populations of people who still live on what are called quilombos. Quilombos being the societies where Black slaves during Brazil's slave period, where they would go and escape from slavery and set up their own societies, what we call maroon societies in the United States. A lot of these quilombos still exist all over the country, and there's always been a discrepancy about how many people live in these quilombolas and having a specific census count for the people who live in these areas. So that report is going to come out. What did it say? Should be released soon, it says. The numbers of the census make sense when we look at the history of Brazil, the last country to abolish slavery. It was almost 400 years of slavery, and the reflection of this is reflected in the color of its people, which is true. You find just Brazil is you want to say a melting pot. You'll see phenotypes in Brazil that you may not see anywhere else in the world because of almost 4 centuries of this mixture going on. With the arrival of the internet in the early 2000s, seeing and recognizing oneself became possible, and the power of representation was a driving force or factor in the number of Black people increasing in census surveys. For Mundo Negro columnist, Professor Ivair Augusto Alves dos Santos, who holds a master's degree in political science from Unicamp University and a PhD in sociology from the University of Brasilia in the nation's capital. The power of the media culture and the Black movement, especially in spaces of power, was fundamental in influencing self-declaration. Most, almost, I would say all Brazilians know who these two people are. This is a couple. This is Lázaro Ramos here, his wife, Thais Araújo. I've always said they should be considered the top Black actor and top Black actress in the country, and they happen to be married. You know, they've both been out for a few decades now. Most people would be able to identify both of these people here. The power of the Black movement. The media, soap operas with more Black representation, spaces of power with more Blacks, affirmative action, growth in the number of Black congressmen and women, and platforms with content about Blacks is important. I could continue a long list, but the existence of a figure like Vinicius Jr. is not by chance. It is the result of the work of many activists, explains the former director of the Department of Human Rights of the Secretariat of Rights of the Presidency of the Republic. He mentioned Vinicius Jr., and unfortunately, this is still a story I haven't been able to get to, but many of you soccer fans will know who Vinicius Jr. is. He's Brazil every few years comes out with a new sensation who's supposed to be, you know, one of the top soccer players in the world. You know, for years it was Neymar. Now Vinicius Jr., who has been playing in Europe for a number of years, he's considered one of the top players in the world. And there was just a huge incident involving racism against Vinicius in a European soccer league. I don't know, it's been a couple of weeks to a month now, maybe a little bit longer. I still have to address that issue, but racism against Brazilians playing in European soccer leagues has been an issue that's been ongoing for decades now. You know, I've done several articles about this, and Vinicius is just the latest case. Okay. This is a popular rapper, Mano Brown, of the legendary hip hop quartet, Racionais MCs. This guy he's one of the most recognizable figures in Brazilian hip hop and just Brazilian celebrities in general. His group Racionais MCs is one of the most important hip hop groups in Brazilian hip hop history. Okay. Some people say Mano Brown is not Black, but I don't know. I see a Black guy with lighter skin. What he identifies as Black, I see him as Black. There's actually a guy who I go back and forth with about this, and he doesn't consider Mano Brown as being Black. He sees him as being strictly Pardo. But okay, for me, Mano Brown is Black. He identifies as Black. To me, that's the end of the point in the discussion. You know. Anyway. How a person constructs this racial identity is another aspect that must be considered. The general trend of the IBGE census is that people have a long process of constructing their self-declaration. These are people who live in spaces where non-Black identity mechanisms are not prevalent. They are in communities where the Black presence is more common, and due to this vulnerability circuit created by racism in Brazil, there are people from this circuit who create solidarity mechanisms, who have family relationships within this nucleus, and over time construct an identity, comments the professor and vice director of the university, Unesp, Juarez Xavier. So what he's saying here is that a lot of persons of visible African descent in Brazil, sometimes they never go through an identity development of Black identity. A lot of them come into this point, specifically when they're forced to coexist in specifically non-white or non-Black majority areas. A lot of people come into a Black identity when they get into areas of Brazilian society where traditionally this has been majority white areas, whether it's, upper crust neighborhoods, whether they go to the college environment, getting on an airplane. These are areas there's so many that I could go over. Being on the runway at a popular fashion show in Brazil. These are all areas that are usually dominated by white Brazilians. So whether they're light skin, brown skin, dark skin, or whatever, a lot of people who have visible African ancestry but have been in denial for years, when they get into these areas and they interact with people who consider themselves white, these attitudes and behaviors of white Brazilians, it shows them like, oh, maybe I am Black after all. They get, gestures and comments that people make about them, stuff they say about their hair, about their skin color, or whatever. And it leads people to identify themselves as black. A lot of times people grow up in Brazil and they don't have this discussion at home. So they go into the world, well, I'm just Brazilian, which, anybody who is born in Brazil is a Brazilian, but they didn't have this connect with how their phenotype might influence their chances in life. And, there's too many studies to document this. So this is what he's talking about in this particular paragraph. Then we get into self-declaration and hetero-identification, which I have to talk about. Brazil was under a military dictatorship between the years 1964 and 1985. And the dictatorship removed data on racial issues from the census. And when this issue returned to IBGE's data collection, the role of the Black movement is fundamental for the emergence of self-declaration. The self-declaration was constituted being part of a great process of debate, of discussion that consumed part of the late 70s, 80s, and from the 90s on. Because the civil military dictatorship removed the data related to racial issues from the census, explains Professor Juarez. He details that when race and color were discussed again, there were more than 100 terms that emerged to identify the color of non-white people. This is something that's often pointed out in studies that talk about, how many Black people are there in Brazil. I forget what year that was. It might have been 1976, where they found that Brazilians use over 134 terms to define their color. This has been an often repeated situation from that census data, almost 50 years ago. And Henry Louis Gates talked about it in his documentaries on Black and Latin America, specifically on the Brazilian section, the Brazilian portion of his documentaries. But this is something that, those of us, they call us Brazilianists, people who non-Brazilians who like to study issues of Brazil, they call us Brazilianists. Those of us who followed this for years, we're familiar with this. You can look it up on the internet. Just Brazilians would often use just all types of color-coded terms to avoid defining themselves as Black, right? This is something that's, a lot of studies have talked about this. This is Frei Davi. He is the founder of an NGO called Educafro. He has helped, I think one report estimated that he's helped over 100,000 Black and poor Brazilians gain access to university, to get a college degree. Okay. Frei Davi, I mentioned him in one of my other videos. He famously talked about how when he grew up, he didn't see himself as Black. I think he might have been a teenager in his early 20s before it was a German Brazilian who actually had to basically sit him down and explain to him, like, dude, you're Black. Who are your people? From what I understand, Frei Davi had or has a white mother. And so he identified, because of the stigma attached to being Black, a lot of people who come out of mixed marriages and unions, they will identify more with the white partner because they know how the stigma of Blackness, how it is in Brazil. And nobody for so many years wanted to be Black. And still, we see now, even with the population being 10.6% who define themselves as specifically Black, for me, that's still an enormous undercount. So then you get either people are going to believe Brazil has about 20, maybe 21 million Black people versus other people who are going to say there's over 120 million. And I'm going to say the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of that, because I've seen too many people who I would define as Black who define themselves as pardos or even white. So again, I don't think we'll ever know, because what's Black for me might not be Black for somebody else. I would just say, out of the huge pardo category, brown or mixed, it could be anywhere from 25 to maybe 35% of people who could be defined as Black. But again, that's just my opinion. Let's keep this moving. It was then necessary to create a mechanism, a very good one, based on self-declaration, and we chose to work with other ethnic racial concepts. For example, Black, or preto in Portuguese, brown or pardo, white meaning branco, yellow, which is actually the Asian descent population in Brazil. They are ethnic issues, and indigenous are racial issues. Indigenous being, what they call Índio, or Brazilian Indians, or natives of Brazilian Indians. And this is another issue that's becoming a controversy. People have talked about this for years. A lot of people who define themselves as pardos are actually closer to having their, of indigenous ancestry, and they also get mixed into the pardo category. a lot of people of indigenous ancestry feel like they've been stripped of their identity with everybody being tossed into this Pardu category, right? That's something else I have to discuss in the future. Like I said, I want to take care of that in a coming video because it's something that it's a huge debate that's going on about it for now. And this is not new. This has been going on, especially since the emergence of the quota system starting in about the year 2000. Now, this was defined after several tests carried out by the IGBE team. Again, a lot of these studies come out based on this Brazilian department, what is the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, and they're responsible for the categories of Black, brown, white, indigenous, and Asian in the country. So how people define themselves to the IBGE is what's going to be recorded. So if I, clearly being Black, if I told one of these IGBE people who came to my house to ask me my color, if I said I was white, they would have to write that down in the study, which is why I'm saying whenever we talk about race and color in Brazil, we have to take it with a grain of salt because we'll never be 100% sure who's Black and who's white and who's Pardo, who's Indian. We'll never really know in Brazil. We can come with pretty close, educated guesses, but I don't think we'll ever know for sure. Another famous couple, this is actress Jennifer Gias. This is popular comedian Yuri Marçal. Yuri Marçal made headlines recently because he became the first Black comedian in Latin America to have his own Netflix special. So in the last 5 years, this guy has blown up. I remember I did a report some years ago just talking about the rise of Black stand-up in Brazil. Stand-up just emerged in Brazil, I don't know, maybe in the last 10, 15 years. And then from there, a small group of Black comedians started carving out their own niche within the stand-up. And Yuri is probably one of the biggest ones. So again, Yuri Marçal, his girlfriend, Jennifer Gias. Another thing you have to point out here, they're one of the few Black woman, Black male celebrity couples in Brazil. It is what it is. Generally, when you see Black male or Black female entertainers in Brazil, generally they have white partners. That's no shame in saying that. It's just the truth. I've looked at this for 23 years and I consistently find this to be true. Anyway, about the hetero identification, there is a change in what was previously understood as Pardo, which basically was every person who identified themselves as neither Black or white, such as Asians, Cafuzos, and Mamelucos. Now, Confuso is a person who's said to be of Black and Indian ancestry or indigenous, versus a Mameluco who's said to be, if I'm not mistaken, I believe this is the people who have white and indigenous ancestry. Okay. Now, the hetero identification is where we've seen for a number of years, because of the quota system, you have people who have considered themselves white for years suddenly defining themselves as pardos or even pretos to get access to the quotas and to get into the university. So what they've had to do is establish judge benches to actually look at people like, well, I consider myself Black or brown, and they will actually judge and say, well, you're not Black, you don't deserve to have these quotas. So hetero identification, you have self-identification, how the person sees him or herself. Then you have the hetero identification, which is taken into account with persons who are looking at that person, what they think that person is. So as of 2012, we started to avoid this type of concept and started to consider, for the purposes of public policies of hetero identification, that pardos are people who have Black ancestry. Again, this is where the dispute comes in. Because what if you have pardos who have mostly indigenous ancestry? Okay, that is the question here. The phenotype of Black people, talking about hair, facial features, and skin tone, is one of the criteria used when cross-referencing data to decide whether a person is considered Black and therefore a candidate for affirmative action policies. This is singer Vanessa Mata, who her comments recently made some headlines. A lot of people were talking about what she said. Let me see if I can find that particular article. Okay, here. What does it say here? Pretos or pardos. Vanessa da Mata's comments generate a debate about the correct classification in the Black racial group. So Vanessa da Mata, she's always been kind of, I don't know, ambiguous to me. I mean, I see clear Black features in her. You see it in her curly hair. But as she says here, let me see if I can find this. Vanessa da Mata, she affirms that she delayed many years to recognize herself as a mulher preta, or a Black woman. So there's perhaps millions of Brazilians who look like Vanessa da Mata who didn't, or it took years for them to define themselves as Black. I have a few articles on the blog where people reach their 60s and only then discover that they are Black. All right. So this is Vanessa da Mata, popular singer. The professor also explains that the declarations of the IBGE census have a great spontaneity factor because the person who answers does not enjoy any immediate benefit. However, it's not possible to know if the person who declared himself to be Pardo is really a person of African descent without mining this data, digging deeper. In hetero identification, because there is a character of interest, there is a greater tendency for the self-declaration to be doubtful. And then the factors of hetero identification are what determine who really deserves to enter, for example, a university through the quota system, which is what this whole controversy is about. Let me take a look at a couple of articles that are related to this piece that I just covered here. Understand how talking about colorism and prejudice in Brazil. Now, this is a comment taken from a manager of diversity and inclusion. She says, I am a Black woman with light skin, a light-skinned Black woman. I am Parda. My mother was Black. My father is a white man. This is from Amanda Ferreira. Again, I don't know what company she works with, but she's a manager of diversity and inclusion. Probably, I don't know, it's some company. And this is what Amanda looks like. So as you can see, I would say, the hair tells us she's of African ancestry, but she has fair skin. She identifies herself as a Black woman with light skin, as she defines herself as a Parda, which is exactly what we're talking about here. But not all Pardas look like her. Okay. Some Pardos, or Pardas, brown or mixed people have more indigenous features, right? Population declaring itself preto or Black maintains growth in the country, points out latest study. This is a report from 2018 that I put out. Okay. These are just some women from the Black Women's March of 2015. Population declaring itself Black maintains growth in the country that the IBGE points out. Between 2016 and 2017, 6% more declared themselves Black, while those declaring themselves white decreased by 0.6%. Okay. Here's another one. This woman who put this article out, I'm not Parda, brown, or mixed. I'm Black and I have a right to this identity. This is the woman who wrote this particular article. And she says, basically, don't call me Parda. I am Black and I have a right to this identity. What do you guys think? Again, you have how she identifies, but how do people identify her? I'm kind of in the air about how Americans would see her, Black Americans in particular. With Black Americans, you have one side that says anybody who has African ancestry is just Black, while others are saying, no, you got to have two Black parents to be Black. I don't know what this woman's parents look like, but I'm just saying, here's another question, because I believe where you're born is going to have something else to do with that. If this woman goes to the United States and she speaks English with a Portuguese accent, people are going to automatically peg her as something else. And then they'll find out she's Brazilian. They're like, no, I don't know what you are, but you're not Black. If this woman was born in a Black community, I think African Americans would more likely define her as Black. That's just how I see it. Specifically, preto or Black, people declaring themselves Black or preto in Bahia. This is another number that has increased in recent years. And this in Bahia is really important when we talk about this, because Bahia is considered to be one of the Blackest states in the country. But even in Bahia, I think somewhere between 15 and 20% of people define themselves as Black, with a large population of 50 to 60% identify themselves as Pardos or brown. So this is a huge thing for a state like Bahia that is considered the African cultural center of Brazil. Self-declared pretos or Blacks outnumber whites in Bahia. So what they're saying is that I think it's maybe 15 to 20% of people in Bahia define themselves as white. So then the number defining themselves as pretos or particularly Black passed the number of people who consider themselves to be white. That's big news. This is Bahia, located in northeastern Brazil. Here, this is a map of Brazil here. Let me see what else we have here to talk about. This is from 2012. So this was a year after I had already started working on this blog. Number of Brazilians declaring themselves preto or Black increases to 16 million. These are just some of the people who are talking about how they came to see themselves as Black. You know, this is a guy, you see him with a Black Panther t-shirt on with his daughter. And these are just some of the people who explain how they came to see themselves as Black. You know, another of the more than 3,700 articles on the blog that you can check out. Let's see what we have here. This article from 2019, the majority in public universities in Brazil are Black. This is one of the articles that really made me start transitioning my view on what's considered Black. Many African Americans who have spent long extended periods in Brazil and who have some connection with university settings, they all say the same thing, like, we can't really call public universities in Brazil majority Black. It's just, we don't see it that way. It's, again, if the only way you can come to this idea is if you include all Pardus in that category. And quite frankly, a lot of Pardus that you will meet are people who are just on the cusp of whiteness. So how do you define these people who look, okay, you can look at this person and say that they're not white because they might have a couple of drops of something, you know, African or indigenous ancestry. But for the most part, you look at them and be like, their appearance is so ambiguous that why would we consider them Black? And this is something that I had to acknowledge myself after living here for some years. The point here is, okay, and this was from the Real Times Online article. Let me see here. This was a big story here. It's saying, according to the IBGE, again here, look at here, Black and brown enrollment is a total of 50.3%. But what I noticed here, where there's a catch here, is that the Movimento Negro, the Black rights movement in Brazil, will use this huge Pardo category, which is 47% of the population, fuse it with the Black population and say that Brazil is 56 and now 57% Black. But then some of those same Pardos will try to get into the university and they'll say, oh, you're not Black or brown. You belong over in that white category. So this is the problem that I have in the contradiction. You want to use the Pardos to increase the number and say that Brazil has 120 million Black people. But when some of those Pardos are just not Black enough, then you say they don't qualify for quotas. You can't have it both ways. That's just the way that I see it, which is why I can no longer say Brazil has 120 million Black people. I've seen this population and it doesn't strike me that way at all. I mean, there's a large percentage. I definitely think it's more than 10.6%. But honestly, my estimate would be somewhere between 10 and 33%. That's just how I see it. This last article is just talking about what is heteroidentification and how will it work in commissions of heteroidentification in this selective process. Again, talking about quotas, how somebody tries to get into a university saying they're Black or brown, there's a bench of judges saying either they're Black or they are not Black enough to qualify for these quotas. So this is one of the reasons that I have to revisit this story and actually go further into this, because some of the debates that's going on online, I don't think it's going to be very long before, you know, Black Brazilian activists are going to have to make a change in their perception about what should be classified as Black in Brazil. Anyway, I'm going to end this video here. Hope you enjoyed. Definitely give me a like on this video. Consider subscribing to this channel if you've seen more videos that you like here, you learn something. Definitely consider sharing the video. I think these types of discussions are going to get bigger as more and more Black Americans continue to mix with people outside of the African American community. This is going to be a big issue as we move forward, as more people take on interracial relationships in the United States. We can look to Brazil. I've often said the United States is going through a Brazilianization process due to this, right? Click on the notification button bell so that you know when I put up another video. I invite you to come back. And with that said, I will end this video here and ask you to come back and check out my next post.